Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I'm here to do a VR to Kasha at Tarot Map and share with you my most unusual decks. So this was a really fun video that Kasha did a little while ago where she shared some of the most unusual decks in her collection, and we actually have a couple of the same ones here. I've actually divided my decks up into 3 different categories because I found that my unusual decks seem to fit into one of 3 categories. So the first one we're going to start with is my unusual decks that have weird artwork. So I love decks that have strange artwork. So the first deck we're going to look at is the Gypsy Palace Tarot. Here's the backs of them. I've edged mine in red, which I think I have a video on actually. And this is a really unusual deck in the way that the artwork is depicted. And it's one that I really love. The people in it are really weird looking. They have that almost kind of alien vibe to them. You know, the long fingers, the things in different perspectives. But I actually really like that. As you can see here in the 7 of Wands, you know, none of those figures look traditional. And they all kind of had weird looks on their faces. The animals that feature in the deck are all a bit odd. And I really like that. And the reason that I like that is because it makes me look at the cards in a different way. It makes me look at them through a different lens and taking on a different perspective. So here we have the Knight of Swords. Now, when I look at a traditional Knight of Swords, like this is nothing that would come to mind, right? I mean, the guy isn't even wearing any pants and he's got 2 different legs. One of them's a peg leg. I mean, it's a bizarre deck, right? And that's kind of what these first few decks are. They're my bizarre decks with my weird artwork. But I really enjoy the artwork that is different because it asks me to look at things from a different perspective. And I find that a lot of times these decks are kind of quite humorous. And I really enjoy that different take. I love this tower. We have all the bodies intermingled together. And I think it's definitely indicative of that kind of inner tower, that interchange that we need to go through. And again, it's just a deck that makes me look at things from a different perspective. I think there will be some nudity in some of these decks, so I forget to mention that from time to time. I love this 3 of Wands. I love all of this sort of growth and landscape going on around this figure that is like leading up from the path, and it's like they're in the landscape, and I think it's just really interesting. So I think that these are decks that really kind of challenge me in a way, and that's really what I enjoy about them. So that is the first deck in my unusual deck collection with weird or strange art, and that is the Gypsy Palace Tarot. So along those same lines, we have the Tarot of the Trance, and this is a deck that I picked up. It is a used deck, and I do believe this deck is out of print. And I picked this one up at the Northwest Tarot Symposium this year. I love the backs on this deck. I just think they're beautiful. The white borders I'm not fond of, but I haven't decided if I'm going to get rid of them or not. But again, really similar to the Gypsy Palace, this deck has, you know, strange artwork. It is still in order because I haven't worked with it yet. But again, we see those kind of different figures. Things are not in their normal perspective, which I think is really interesting. So this is a US Games deck, and one of the things that I like about it is the minors are very pip-like. So we don't have, you know, the full scenes depicted as we do on a standard Waitsmith deck. This is definitely a pip style deck. It's more in line with a Marseille style of reading. And again, that's just another thing that really helps challenge me, helps me think of things, to really focus in on the elemental and the numerological aspect of the cards, but as well to take note and to get those intuitive hits from the artwork going on inside these cards. It is quite busy inside this artwork, and I think that maybe if I were to take the borders off, I think that would probably help a little bit, because I feel like the borders kind of restrict the artwork, and I think that this is a deck where the artwork really kind of needs to flow. But it's just an interesting deck, and one with, again, bizarre artwork, and not one that I had actually seen before when I saw it on the table at the Northwest Tarot Symposium, and I saw it and I was like, ooh, that looks like a blue gypsy palace, so I think I kind of need it. Although this is definitely way more pippish than the gypsy palace is, but still one that I really enjoy looking through. So that is another one in my weird art collection, or I should say my unusual art collection, and that's the Tarot of the Trance. And the last deck in my bizarre weird art collection is the Saki Saki Tarot. Here's the backs of it. I think the backs are really cool. I love the size of this deck. This deck is like the perfect size. It's skinnier than a traditional tarot, but it's roughly the same height, maybe a little bit smaller, but such a great size. Again, this is another deck that has that same kind of bizarre artwork. There's a lot of headless figures in this deck, which is very interesting. And again, we have that kind of strange perspective. It's just another deck that offers you another way to look at the tarot, to kind of shake up your normal interpretations. Like here's the Temperance with, you know, the really bizarre face, and we definitely get that kind of cracked idea. But I love this kind of like, it definitely feels like a card of alchemy to me. And so I really tap into that more with that particular card. Again, it's a beautiful deck. It is still in order because I was planning on doing a walkthrough of it. Yeah, so anyway, just a really interesting deck. It's like a really fun deck. It's got really fun artwork in it. It's a deck that I don't think takes itself too terribly seriously, which is kind of nice because sometimes it's just nice to get a deck that is just, you know, just fun to read, fun to work with. But it definitely has you know, that bizarre art that I do kind of tend to like. So that's the last deck in my sort of bizarre art collection, and that is the Saki Saki Tarot. So the next grouping of decks that we're going to take a look at is decks that depart from the norm. So while these aren't necessarily decks with weird artwork or anything like that, they are decks that kind of do something different in the way that they present the tarot, and therefore make them sort of unusual in my collection. So the first deck that we're going to take a look at is the Wooden Tarot. And this is one of my favorite decks because this deck is very pippish. Love that Wheel of Fortune card. But it definitely ties into the more elemental numerological aspect of the tarot, which I really enjoy. And I know that this is a deck that is really difficult for a lot of people to read. And I do think that it kind of requires you to stop and think. And again, that's one of the things that I see as a theme in my unusual decks. Most of my unusual decks are decks that I really have to stop and think about. I love that Happy Squirrel card. Like here we see the sun where the fox has the sunflower for a face and the face is up here in the sun. I mean, really different depictions. I mean, I suppose this could go into the weird artwork as well, but then we have like this perfectly normal looking arrows here. Love this hermit with his eyes clouded over, and he's in the cave all wrapped up. I think that's beautiful. But again, this is a deck that I think just kind of takes the tarot and does something a little bit different with it, and in that sense it's kind of an unusual deck. Again, it's very much a pip style deck. We don't have a full scene going on in the cards, but I quite love the openness of it, and this for me is a deck that really asks me to kind of set aside my preconceived notions and to look at things from a different perspective. And I think that's really one of the things that I appreciate about it. And this has also my favorite High Priestess card. I don't know. I've shown it like a million times. I already passed it, but anyway, it has my favorite High Priestess card because it has a whale. And I also love the Emperor and Empress because they are elephants. Love that Chariot too. It's one of my favorite chariots. So there's so many decks or so many cards in this deck that I'm just like, I love that card. I love that card. I love that card. Beautiful deck. So that's one of my unusual decks that departs from the norm. That is the Wooden Tarot. Similar to that is another deck that sort of departs from the norm, and that is the Antique Anatomy Tarot. So again, this is another pip style deck, and this is the mass market edition, or the first mass market edition, because I do believe there's a second one either out or coming out with different cardstock. But again, it really is a pip style deck, but I think what makes it unusual is the use of the bits of anatomy in it, and the surgical instruments that we see. And here, instead of a traditional empress, we see the half figure where we can see her heart, we can see her ribs, and then we can see the full bottom of her. It's just very interesting. Again, this is a deck that really asked me to look at things from a different perspective, because again, the artwork is unusual, and the way that each of the pips is presented is unusual, which I find completely fascinating. I really enjoy working with this one. Again, this is another one that I work with very elementally, very numerologically, and because that really resonates with the way I read, I really enjoy decks that tap more into that. But I love decks that also have enough illustration going on that can add a new layer to my readings. I do love when deck creators do something a little bit different with it. And this deck definitely does something a little bit different in a really beautiful way. And I love all the flowers. So similar to the Wooded Tarot in that it kind of asks you to look at things in a different way, and it kind of presents the tarot in a different way, that is the Antique Anatomy Tarot. So another deck that really approaches the tarot in a different way is the Mysteries of Mary Tarot, and I do believe that Kasha showed this one as well. And this one is one of my favorite decks. I love working with this deck. This one kind of blends the first two categories together, not in that the artwork is weird, but it is different because these are actual what do they call them? Like a diorama? I think there's another word for it. Anyway, these are actual little scenes that were set up and photographed. And that's really interesting to me because that's not something we often see, right? It's not drawn, it's not painted, it's not generated on a computer. It was handcrafted by the artist to create all of these images, which I think is really interesting and also in its own right very unusual. But I've put it in the category of decks that depart from the norm because this particular deck focuses on the inner mystery of the journey of the soul as portrayed by Mary. So it's a beautiful deck. I find that I personally kind of read it more like an oracle in that I pull a card every week and that card sits up on my altar for the week. And I read the information in the guidebook because the guidebook has the stories, which is really, I think, a big part of this deck is tapping into the stories of Mary. And I sit with those stories, I read those stories, and I allow this card to sit. And I don't actually do full-on readings with this deck, or I should say at this point I don't. Right now I'm still kind of getting to know this deck in that sense, but we're working slowly together. And it's become just a deck that I pull one card for the week to stay with me throughout the week. And like I said, it's on my altar space. So I really enjoy this deck in that way, but it is definitely a more unusual deck because it approaches the tarot through that lens. And of course we have this gorgeous artwork that was all hand created. So it's just a beautiful deck. I really enjoy working with it. The guidebook for this deck is just amazing. So definitely one of my favorites in my collection, but unusual in its own right. So that is the Mysteries of Mary Tarot. So another deck that departs from the norm for me is the Muse Tarot. And this might surprise some people because this is a, mass market deck. And it is created by Chris Ann, who also did the Lightseers Tarot. But this particular deck for me, what makes this deck unusual in my collection is more in the way that I use it. And I think it does depart from the norm, from what we normally see in terms of the artwork. it's a really beautiful deck, and I've mentioned it in a couple videos now, and I really enjoy working with it, but I don't use it like a tarot. I use it more like an oracle, and I allow it to be sort of a portal into creative exploration, and I use it kind of as a jumping off point for my own creative efforts. Like I use it as a muse, right? And I think that's what makes this deck really wonderful, is that for me, it doesn't really read like a tarot, and that's, in that sense, it's unusual for me because it is a tarot deck, but I don't work with it that way. And I think that the artwork, although it is, you know, photo collage, it's seamless photo collage, which I think I've mentioned before. It's absolutely beautiful, seamless photo collage. But the artwork is different. So again, this one kind of like the Mysteries of Mary kind of checks both those boxes because it is a bit of a departure from the norm, from what we tend to see on cards. But it's also, the artwork is a bit of a departure as well, just because it's not your typical Rider-Waite-Smith inspired deck. The kings are also all sideways, which when I was trying to use this as a tarot deck really threw me in readings, and I really didn't care for that. But as just a creative prompt, it works fine because I only pull one card at a time. But so anyway, that is another one, or I guess the last one in my category of unusual decks that depart from the norm, and that is the Muse Tarot. So in the last category, and the last few decks that we're going to take a look at, is my decks that are unusual because they have that creep factor. They are kind of creepy, a little bit shadowy, kind of weird decks in that way. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. So the first deck in my kind of creepy, weird, unusual decks is the Tarot of the Unknown Shadow. And this is a deck that I really haven't come to terms with yet. There are some cards in this deck that really kind of creep me out. And again, it's photo collage, right? So we have a lot of layers. We have a lot of photo manipulation going on. I wouldn't say it's seamless, but it's disjointed in a way that I think is intentional because it's unnerving. And I think for me, that's what this deck is and why it's unusual, because it's an unnerving deck. It does things in a sort of disjointed, off-putting way that I guess really digs into the shadow. But here we have the Three of Pentacles, and for me, this card is freaking creepy too. Like, I don't know. I think it's the old photos and the disjointedness, the kind of, I don't want to say clunkiness because I have another deck by this creator, so I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I feel like the clunkiness and the disjointedness in the artwork is meant to set you off balance. Because like I said, I have another deck by this creator and that deck doesn't feel that way. It feels very seamlessly put together. And this deck for me feels a bit off-putting. So, I mean, look at this Empress. That's a creepy freaking Empress. Do we normally see creepy Empress? No. Does it make you stop and think? Probably. So I think that this is a really interesting deck, and it's very unusual because I think of the way that it makes me feel, the images that I see. I know that this is a deck that sometimes when I share it on my channel, people are very off-put by it. I apologize if you are off-put by it. Skip over to the next deck. Although I do have to say that my next few decks are my creepy decks in my collection, so they might be all a little bit off-putting. But like for me, the Magician in this deck really just kind of, there he is. That for me wraps up this whole deck in one card. That is a creepy card, and it gives me the willies every time I see it. And sometimes that makes me not want to work with this deck. Yeah, he creeps me out every time I see him. I'm not a fan. So that is the Tarot of Unknown Shadows. So still in that realm of creepy, unusual, but not quite as bad, I don't think, as the last deck we saw, is the Tarot of Curiosities. And this deck, I actually quite enjoy. It's a little bit hard to see, and hopefully it will show up, but the it has a very vintage vibe to it, and again, very collaged. a little bit disjointed, but you know, like true collaging. We definitely have some kind of a little bit more confronting cards in this one as well, but it's just a really kind of interesting, but again, creepy take on the tarot. The suit of swords, because it's needles, is not my favorite, and I have considered seeing if there's something I can do about that, because I really like the rest of the deck. I'm just not a fan of the suit of swords in this deck, or the suit of needles. But it's very interesting. And again, it definitely has that different kind of take on the tarot, but it also has that total creep factor. It's just, again, it's a little bit off-putting. And sometimes when you want to shake things up a bit, like off-putting, I guess, totally works for that. These few decks are decks that I tend to work with more around the Halloween season, around Samhain. That tends to be more when I turn to these type of decks, that kind of creepier vibe. And so I really like having decks like this in my collection for those particular times of the year. But there are some cards in this deck that I just, you know, that do kind of bug me. Again, unusual and unusual creepy. So that is the Tarot of Curiosities. So going a little less creepy, a little more bizarre, we get into the Animalis Os Fortuna. And this is, how does this open? This deck, again, has kind of creepy imagery. See, here we can see the magician as the cat, but then inside the little, the crystal ball here, we can see the skeleton of the cat. So again, just really interesting take on the tarot. I like that it's black and white. That's really kind of cool. One of the things that I like about it. I mean, see, here's the hangman as a bat, but it's a skeleton bat. So we're into that unusual artwork. Not, for me, this one's not quite so creepy. It's unusual and it's different, but it's not really creepy. The only reason that I put it in this particular section was because we do have a lot of bones and kind of half dead, almost like zombie looking things, because these animals, they're still like doing things, they're still in action, so they're not really dead, they're more like zombie animals, which is kind of how I see this deck. Like, see, here we have the turtle and we can see his rib cage. So it's just kind of an interesting take on an animal deck. So that's another of my unusual, semi-creepy tarot decks. And the last of my most unusual tarot decks that I have to share with you is the Singing Serpent Tarot. This I do believe is out of print, because I believe there were only 100 made. This was a very small print run. And again, this is another black and white kind of alien looking creatures. Definitely a little bit more on the creepy side of things. But again, it's like it took the creator took the traditional sort of Rider-Waite-Smith tarot and kind of creepified it a little bit, which I think is really interesting. I love that Temperance is the alchemy card. See, here we have the sun with these kind of alien looking figures. Even the sun looks a little bit alien and bizarre. And it's just a really interesting look at the tarot. These images, again, like so many others that I've shown in this video, really do kind of tap into something a little bit different. They're a great way to shake up your reading. And I think unusual decks are really interesting to work with, because they do ask you to look at things a little bit differently and to maybe consider some ideas outside of your norm, maybe get you out of your comfort zone a little bit too, which I think is really interesting, especially, you know, if you want to give things a little bit of shake up and you're looking to kind of, you know, maybe do something a little bit different. I think unusual decks like these are really fantastic for that. Quite dig the backs of this deck. I think they're really interesting. But that is the Singing Serpent Tarot. So that is a look at some of the most unusual tarot decks in my collection. I want to thank Kasha for this wonderful tarot tag. I've really enjoyed watching her video and some of the others that some of the other people have done. It's been really fascinating to see what unusual and interesting decks people have in their collection. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for the decks featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.